You're watching DIY with Max. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to repurpose the foam that your Bowflex adjustable dumbbells arrive in. I will use this foam to make it into a rack for these dumbbells using only duct tape. Hey Max, what are you doing? I'm trying to make a video on how I built this stand out of foam that the dumbbells came in with using just duct tape. That sounds like a good idea from 3 years ago when they first arrived because you were too cheap to buy the actual stand. Can't you come up with something more original? Oh, you think you could do better? Okay, hotshot, you make the video. Fine, I will. Fine, I'm out of here. Now that we got rid of him, let's jump into 3D Builder to visualize my idea for this build.
This is an existing railing in the garage where I want to mount the dumbbell rack. The material for the shelf will be most likely 1/2-inch plywood. I need some way to support the shelf, so let's add a 2x4 to the railing to rest the shelf on. It should be rolled about 20 degrees to make it easier to grab the dumbbells. Next, I will add a support column with a base to reinforce the 2x4 to make sure it can handle the weight of the equipment. The base should make it easier to mount to the middle railing. The shelf will be cut to size, and I will cut some recesses in the corners to contour the railing. The shelf will need borders around the edge and around the dumbbells to keep them from sliding around. Once again, I will roll the shelf 20 degrees to match the slope of the 2x4 mounting supports and attach it with some 4-inch screws from the bottom. To support the weight in the front, I need some 4x4 columns cut with notches to match contour of the cinder block support and 20-degree cuts on top to sit flush with the shelf. Finally, I will add weights and hope that nothing comes crashing down. Full disclosure, I'm not an engineer, so anything can happen. This is for entertainment purposes only. Any builds resembling this one will be at your own risk. Stick around to the end to see if I can turn this design into reality. These are the supplies I will need for this build. A 6x4 foot piece of plywood for the shelf, 4 foot 2x4 for support on the railing, 8 foot 4x4 for the legs to support the shelf in the front, and the last piece is a 16 foot 2x2 PVC molding strip that will function as a border for the dumbbells. I chose to go with the PVC molding intentionally. It's a very easy material to work with, and I would not have to worry about splitting the 1x2 pieces. The best place to start with a project like this is the basics. In my case, it's the shelf that the dumbbells will sit on. I placed the weights on the plywood in the rough position where they will sit, and I started to mark out the side rails around the weights themselves and the outer edges. Now that everything's marked out, let's get this shelf cut out. A little tip I picked up along the way: if you tie the cables into a knot and then plug them in, your power tools will never come unplugged while you're working. I'm using the circular saw to cut the shelf to the correct width and depth. Next, I'm measuring out all the side rails for the dumbbells and cutting them to length. I'm really enjoying working with this PVC molding. It cuts really easy with a hacksaw. I left the middle rails an inch longer because the wall I will be mounting them to is bowed. What a shocker. With all the pieces surrounding the dumbbells laid out in place, it was time to check the fit of the dumbbell tray to make sure everything fits before I start putting the frame together. It fit like a glove. Time to put the frame together and attach it to the surface for test fit. I proceeded to make the pilot holes in the bottom rail to mark where the other rails will attach. The PVC material is very forgiving, so even if the pockets are not perfectly 90-degree angles, I can maneuver them into place when I attach the rails to the shelf. At this stage, I was still deciding if I wanted to further divide the side pockets of the shelf or just wrap the rail around the perimeter, so I left them off for now. To attach the railing, I once again drilled all the pilot holes through the face of the shelf. Once I flipped the shelf over, I lined up the rails underneath and proceeded to attach them. After attaching the rails, I marked out the corner cutouts and removed them off camera with a hacksaw. Upon further consideration, I decided that I should just do the borders around the perimeter. This will give me the most flexibility for racking different size weights in the future. After attaching the bottom, I attached the top of the side rails. With the full rails assembled, it is time to separate the base and the railing. I flipped the shelf over to remove all the screws and get it ready for paint. I love stuff like this. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I'm using leftover Sherwin-Williams primer and paint in one to paint the shelves in this deep red color that matches the color scheme of the gym walls. Even with the 2-in-1 paint and primer, it took 2 coats to make sure the grain from the plywood was no longer visible. Thank you so much for sticking around this long. Can't wait to show you the big reveal at the end. Let's keep going. While I had the red paint out, I decided to also pre-paint the 4x4 front shelf support before I cut them to fit. After some preliminary measurements, I will only need 1 4-foot section of the 4x4s, split in 2 halves for the legs of the shelf. That's one last thing to paint. Next, I painted the railing in a dark gray contrasting color. This part was made a little more difficult by the fact that I was painting the PVC molding. This molding has a rough side on the edge that painted really well, and a smooth side on front and back that did not take the paint as well as I expected. The problem was the front and back surfaces were smooth and the brush would leave lines on the painted area. Luckily, I found an easy solution. After paint dried, I lightly sanded the paint on all smooth sides and applied the second coat. Next time, I will definitely rough up the smooth surface before painting. While the painted parts were drying, I started to build the handrail support that the shelf will sit on by cutting the 2x4 to size and inserting it between the rail. To make my life a little easier, I attached it with 1 screw on the right side, and that allowed me to swivel the 2x4 just enough to find the angle for the shelf I was looking for. I also used a scrap piece of plywood to get the spacing dialed in for the height of the support beam. Once I had the angle dialed in, I added a second screw to lock the beam in place. With the beam secured, I built a center support stand with a plywood bottom to make it easier to attach to the railing. I added 2-inch builder screws to the back and the sides of the beam support. I'm sure it's overkill, but better safe than sorry. Next, I secured the beam support stand to the bottom rail with 2 screws on each side. And finally, I added some more 2.5-inch screws to the back of the beam to make sure it can handle the 250-pound load it needs to carry. At this point, I was getting really excited because this is the last piece of the build that I have to paint before I can start putting some of the parts together and get a glimpse of what this dumbbell rack will look like. Little did I know what was waiting for me around the corner. Just keep watching. While the railing was drying, I inserted the shelf into place and proceeded to take a little rest by lying down to create a stencil for the front support leg of the shelf. I'm sure some math genius could do some math and figure out all the angles for this part, but I don't have the time like that or the desire to do math. So I found that the best way to get an accurate representation of the part with a lot of strange angles is to use a piece of cardboard as a stencil. By cutting out the side profile of the part and transferring it to a piece of wood will get me the same result. So that is what I did. Let's see how I made out with this stencil. I placed the cardboard cutout onto the support beam and traced the shape of the cardboard onto the beam using a piece of 1x2 PVC at the edge to get a nice straight line. Once I got the bottom done, I moved to the top of the stencil and marked the angle there. I started with the middle cut because by doing so, I got to cut out tops of both support beams with just one cut. I lightly sanded the cut off piece with 100 grit sandpaper to level out the top the shelf will sit on, and proceeded to cut out the notch on the other side of the piece. The notch will stabilize the front support beam and prevent it from sliding out during load. Cutting this out by hand was a total pain in the butt. I attempted to cut from all different angles. And finally was able to cut out the notch. Note to self, when this YouTube thing takes off, get some power tools. Once again, I lightly sanded the notch with 100 grit sandpaper and decided to test the piece out to make sure it fits well before I go tracing it onto the second front support. The right support fit perfectly, so I used it to transfer all the angles to the left support and got it cut out. You would think the second time would be easier. Well, it was not, but I'll spare you the pain of watching me struggle again. With all the edges of the supports sanded smooth, I went back to the shelf to double check the height to make sure it was good, and that is when I realized that the shelf is way too high. And in order for me to lift the weights in and out, I'll have to do super shrugs every time. I'm just not about that. So like Elon says, let's just fix it in post. 1, 2, 3, all done. The new height is much better for getting the dumbbells on and off the shelf. Now let me take a moment and go over what I had to do to lower the shelf support by almost a foot. I removed the middle support and cut the new wedges with the same angle. I lowered the support on top of them and secured them to the lower railing. Let's get the shelf back on and place the dumbbell borders on top to get a glimpse of what the finished product will look like. I also had to remeasure and cut the height of the supports. Luckily, the bottom cutout did not have to be adjusted in any way. Because I was not 100% convinced that the border paint fully dried, I put the shelf together on a drop cloth. I placed it face down and lowered the shelf on top. Next, I reinstalled all the screws into their respective pilot holes, and just like that, the shelf was finally built. With the shelf complete, I can install it on the railing. The fit was a little tight, so I had to use a scrap of wood to hammer it into place. After I was sure the shelf was in the final space, I put several screws in to secure it in place and keep it from falling while I grabbed the front supports. Everything was nice and tight, so I proceeded to secure the front supports with screws from the top through the shelf. For my peace of mind, I added a few more screws just in case. Now that the supports are installed, I can go back and secure the top of the shelf with a few more screws to the lower rail support. A few more screws for a peace of mind can't hurt. With the build complete, it is time to add the dumbbell tray and all the dumbbells to make sure that this shelf can handle the weight. While the weight test was in progress, I painted the front border, and that brings this project to an end. Let's roll that B-roll of the finished product.
Thank you guys so much for sticking it out to the end. I hope you enjoyed the build as much as I did. Please like, subscribe, hit that bell icon so you get notified when my next video comes out. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you guys next time.